All right, and we are live. Hey there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we've got with us John Hwang. How are you doing, John?
Hey Ben, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going good, going good. Hopefully your year is ending well.
Absolutely, I'm really stoked. I'll be traveling to Japan for a month starting next month, so really excited about that. How about yourself?
Yeah, I got back from China about a month ago, so probably no more big traveling plans. But no, I'm excited to kind of have a chill rest of the year, I think, on my side.
Nice, nice.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, before we get too deep, I'd love to kind of get a background from you. You know, you've got a pretty it's just a lot of things that you've done in your background. So I'd love to kind of hear kind of what you've done both in the data world, but outside of that as well.
Yeah, sounds good. So right now, I write a blog or a Substack, or that's what I'm mainly known for, called Enterprise AI Trends. I write mostly about what I think is going on in enterprise AI, both from like a technical guy's perspective, but also like a investor's perspective. Um, because I think following the AI trends, helps you sort of allocate capital more efficiently, whether you're doing it at a company or your stock portfolio. Before that, I was a generative AI architect at AWS. So I was there while the Bedrock service was launching. Bedrock is like their AWS version of the serverless AI inference API. And I was helping companies adopt SageMaker, which is their ML platform. I also did about 2 years of analytics solution architecture, basically helping companies get their data ready for large scale ML consumption, whether it's like, refactoring their entire data access layer and things like that. But yeah, as Ben mentioned, I also wore different hats. I was a early product manager on Alexa, so I helped bring the voice assistant to like cars, so you can do something like, "Where's the nearest Starbucks?" And while you're driving, you can imagine that right now you are using OpenAI or ChatGPT from your desktop, so your location actually doesn't matter. But if you're out and about, how the LLM or the AI model process your query might be different based on where you are. So I was working on that, like early 2017 or 2016 and things like that. And and before that, I was a derivative trader in Wall Street. I was working at Morgan Stanley and a few other shops, doing basically two things really: trading options, but also back testing and making models for modeling implied volatility surfaces or option trading strategies and things like that. Mostly medium frequency stuff. And on the side, I was also a adjunct lecturer at University of Washington doing computer science lecturing. And I believe Ben was also a Husky. So did a bunch of random stuff. I kind of shows my age as well. I graduated college almost 20 years ago. So that's what brings me here.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll definitely talk a little bit about kind of your experience. I want to dig into like your experience at Morgan Stanley and kind of how you went from working, or how you kind of currently are in software and very heavily in AI, and then again started kind of on more the finance side. But I like asking people, because I think we are very work focused as a culture. What do you do outside of work?
I play a lot of tennis. That's why part of the reason, I like to just spend my time in sunny states. Uh, so you can play tennis all year round. I also run a lot. I run like a bunch of marathons and things like that on the side. Yeah. I guess it's kind of not that interesting. I think a lot of people in tech either gravitate toward either like exercising or gaming, but yeah, I enjoy it. Honestly, trying not to like work too much. I think that's the real challenge.
Yes, I will attest to that. It's always like you always just find yourself in front of the screen and doing more work. What's your marathon time?
My PR is 2:57.
It's gotta be good, right? I feel
Yeah,
like.
yeah. There was like, in Chicago Marathon, I think when a lot of people talk about their marathon PRs, like there are some crazy people out there that's going to check like, against the marathon websites. But yeah, it was in 2019 Chicago. But yeah, like, it's a pretty like intense hobby though. Like you have to run like 50, 60 miles a week just to maintain that shape. So I don't do that anymore, but yeah, running more for health reasons.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine at the same time running that much may not be as good for your body to some extent.
There's no direct correlation though.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool. So again, before we dive into data, since you've got such a kind of eclectic background, I just want to kind of ask about your experience in Morgan Stanley. How do you kind of get into that position in terms of like being a derivative trader? You led kind of the VIX, it sounded, department, and kind of maybe even setting the foundation there. How's that all get started?
Yeah, it's interesting because like we have to kind of travel back in time to like 2006 when I started my career. If you think about it, like I think finance was the original sort of data-driven industry. In 2006, there was no pandas, there was no, like Spark. All these things came out in early 2010. So back then, like people were, working largely off of flat files, database extracts. But pretty much like everything that people are doing these days were still being done, except in a very manual and painstaking manner. So yeah, like I mean, how I got into the industry, I studied computer science and math at Stanford, and I just kind of did an internship and then got a job. So nothing crazy there. The reason I think finance was like a very kind of quantitative industry even back then. Obviously, it is more automated now, but yeah, like one of my first projects was to analyze like a 10-year history of real estate prices and see if we can, find like a opportunity to structure that as a like a purchasable instrument. And if you think about it, it's basically studying historical data and figuring out what the distribution is, and trying to fit like some model and find out the parameters and see if you can like make some margin off of that and manage risk. So all the concepts that the data analysts and data engineers do these days, such as like data cleaning, getting data, acquiring data, and massaging the data, all these things existed even back then. And by the way, this existed in 1980s as well, 60s. So like all the things that we're doing these days, wasn't really any different, except the tooling is a lot better and the data sizes are much larger scale, and there's a lot more unstructured data. So anyways, that was a bit of a digression. Yeah, the main job was to like look at where the option prices were trading in the past. For example, VIX is like a 30-day implied volatility index. So that meant that I had to somehow get the S&P 500 option prices for the past 10 years. So prior to like 2007, 2008, which means like late 90s. And getting the data itself was pretty hard because, we didn't have fast databases back then. We had like Sybase, which is like something that doesn't even exist, I think, anymore. I don't know if it still exists, but so yeah, like all these things that like people take a lot less time to do, which are things like loading gigabytes of things into RAM that wasn't possible. You had to like do everything off of disk, and write Perl scripts instead of like writing Python, because Python really wasn't like a production ready data language even back then. I mean, world changed a lot. So, but yeah, the fundamentals of the job was to analyze historical data, plot them, figure out if there's any patterns, try to fit some models, build some real-time dashboards. I think by real-time dashboard I mean like an Excel spreadsheet where it has like a like a C sharp, like a VBA, I don't know, connection to some, I don't know, like and then you get like a So your spreadsheet is like the dashboard, no fancy Tableau or anything like that to spot opportunities. And the actual execution was like done with like, SOAP or like XML APIs. No, there was like no concept of like a HTTP REST, like, API even back. I mean, and there was, but like, it was not very mainstream. So yeah, like the job was like a lot more hectic and more generalist. You kind of had to be, because like there was no like DevOps role, or like there was no like data engineer role. Like your DB admin was like the data engineer in some sense, because like he was a guy who knew where the tables were. Like there was no concept of like a centralized data catalog or anything like that. So yeah, like it's just fascinating how much progress the community has made over the years. I'm very proud of that. And also, yeah, I'm sure the job is a lot more pleasant these days if you had to replicate it.
Yeah, it's more. I imagine it's more pleasant. It's more specific, or like more. All the roles are a little more broken down into their specific tasks. Where as before, like you said, the data there was less data to deal with. There was, technology was more disparate, so the expectations could almost be lower. Whereas now, with more data, with more tooling, people want more faster. So I think that's kind of the world we live in nowadays.
Yeah. One thing I'll say though is that even though there's a lot better tooling, if you think about it, not a lot of that effort ultimately translates into business outcome. So I would argue that even though everything I did back then was complete spaghetti code and like, complete shit show in some sense, we still, drove a lot of business outcome, because we had a lot less time to write code. We had to be very intentful about what we're doing. Whereas like now, I think, a lot of people can just spin up like a data science project very easily and just kind of do it. But then, I think there's not a lot of like very rigorous thinking about like what exactly do we need to do. So I think, yeah, making stuff is easy now, but at the same time, like 80-20 rule, like very tiny portion of that will actually be useful.
Yeah, probably also the fact that so much more is possible, whereas back then it was like, look, we can really only do so much with what we have, and it makes you focus a little more, where now it's like we could do what feels like an endless amount of projects, and like you said, 80 or 90% of those projects are pointless. You can do it, it might be cool, but it really won't drive much in terms of the impact. So
Yeah, and like just the last comment about like data science, or I guess quant trading in finance, the data sets are mainly time series. So I think that's another thing about data science as a profession. The industry that you go into will largely sort of determine what kind of data science you're going to be doing. And finance is like you have to be good at math modeling, and you have to be good at like time series, and like just generally be more math heavy. Whereas I think some other industries like healthcare, you want a lot of domain knowledge, like lots of random factoids about how insurance policies work or something like that. I think that might be more beneficial than like knowing a lot of math. So I think, yeah, just like kind of factor in which industry piques your interests into your career decisions.
Yeah, I can double on the healthcare point. I am currently kind of digging into healthcare project right now, and uh, there's a lot you have to know, like you said, about insurance, how it operates, how ICD-10 codes and ICD-9 codes, and how those all work. And even then, beyond that, you have to understand that like you basically have infinite projects, because it's like, well, are you looking specifically at a specific set of diagnosis? Are you looking for a specific problem? So it is kind of this endless, like you have to know a lot about healthcare, some little bits about disease, etc. But your experience kind of spans, I think, a lot of different spaces. Finance, tech. You also reference academia. How do you feel like having this like multidisciplinary background has kind of given you an edge on taking on some of the complex problems you've had to deal with?
So, generally speaking, I'm going to take a step back. When people talk about career advice, like should you be a specialist or should you be a generalist? I think the answer you're going to get from a lot of people is just be a specialist in something, and that's how you make the most money. I guess like if you take out money from the equation, though, being a generalist is actually harder than being a specialist in some sense. And sounds counterintuitive, but like it just means that you have to kind of be pretty good at like new things all the time. And I mean, it depends on like what drives your dopamines, right? Do you get more of a kick out of like working on new things like every 3, 4 years, or like do you like to just like keep doing the same thing for like 20 years or something like that? Um, Being a generalist has a few advantages. So, the famous computer scientist Alan Kay said, perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And I think knowing a lot about different things allows you to wear a different hat when you need it. So, for example, like if someone asks you to like do some ML project, okay, you're making a new prediction model. Being able to wear a product manager hat as a data, like a ML engineer, will allow you to sort of ask better questions like to your business stakeholders, because like no one's perfect. Like people, I mean, most likely the PM you're talking to is probably not that technical. So there's some space of problems that require like a joint function of like both product management knowledge as well as ML knowledge. And that is basically the gap that you're able to fill by knowing both things. To be specific, let's say you're a product manager working on Alexa, which is me. Your boss asks you to like make like a GDPR compliant version of that, which is what I did. Now, if you think about it, you can just tell your engineer, hey, make this GDPR compliant. We have to like log these things and purge these things from these different things. But like, if you're that PM that actually knows how all these services are wired together at a very deep level, then you can actually, find edge cases that no one could even think of. So, for example, like there was a cache invalidation rule that one of our backend services had, which turned out to be retaining logs longer than what the EU allowed you to. And I was able to find that bug because like it was so deep into the backend infrastructure. But so all I'm really saying here is that if you know different things, it can come in handy. Now, I'm not saying that from an ROI perspective, like you have to know everything. No, but I think it does help like an engineer to like be interested in business once in a while, and vice versa. But yeah, I mean, like it's easier said than done, right? But like so it can be helpful. And the other sort of underrated benefit of being a generalist is that if you want to do something entrepreneurial, it's very helpful. Ben, I mean, you're an entrepreneur. You would know that you have to wear a lot of different hats. Like you have to like do a lot of random shit that pops up in your business. And if you're so inclined to be a one area specialist, it's really not a good match for the types of problems that you're going to face as an entrepreneur. I think it also makes you a better investor. So if you know a lot about different things, then you can probably analyze a stock better. I mean, I can't justify that claim right now, but I think it does. From a first principles based perspective. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that kind of answer, and I like that you referenced like if you take money out of it, because I think sometimes it's very easy, especially early on in your career, that like money is the only thing that you make or the only thing that you really care about. But eventually you realize that in order to like kind of enjoy what you're doing to a degree, like you have to find things that you like too. You have to find a good mix. Money is important, but it'll eventually wear on you if you don't like what you're doing.
I also don't. This is also like a side observation, but especially in the age of AI, I know it sounds super corny when I say that. So I'm just saying it as like a prefacing. I am not exactly sure what the real benefit of over specialization is. I think there's extreme diminishing returns of like knowing every little fact about something when you can just pull up from a LLM. I mean, so the better our search engines get, there might be a real sort of limit to how much I will be willing to pay you to know that on demand from your meat brain. I mean, of course, like, that could be useful in some cases. Like if you're a surgeon, if you're like some neurosurgeon, then yeah, I don't think, LLMs can help. But, but yeah, I mean, a lot of like knowledge work, what's the difference between like a 20-year experience data engineer versus like a 15-year or 10-year data engineer? I don't know. Like, I actually don't know these answers anymore in a very clear manner. I think it's very context dependent, actually.
Yeah. Things have gotten a little fuzzy for sure. Kind of going to, on that AI space and also your experience setting up companies' data infrastructure at AWS, you guys spend a lot of time, I think, staring at and helping companies set up data tooling. So what was kind of the themes you saw across like Fortune 100 companies in terms of their data infrastructure?
I don't have nice things to say. Let me just put it that way. I can't name any clients, obviously. I think certain themes, just to like off the top of my head, would be: one is over-engineered. Two, there is poor data governance. I'll get very specific about what I mean by that in a second. Three, there's no like central visibility to what data sets like a company has. So there's like no one person that can say, hey, I know where every table is, who maintains it, and like how often it's refreshed, and like who owns the ops when the pipeline breaks down. I don't think there's like any company in Fortune 100 that can tell you, hey, yeah, we know that guy, and this is the system of record, and this is the standard operating procedure in these situations. I don't think like any company I've talked to actually has their act together like that. And maybe it's impossible to do that. I think another thing I would just say is that it's extremely over provisioned. What I mean by that is that there's a lot of wastefulness in terms of like how these companies are spinning up their like Spark clusters or like Hive clusters or whatever, like versus their actual like usage. There's a lot of money that is being wasted. There's a lot of like data retention that never sees the light of the day, and that people are just like storing and like paying millions or like tens of millions of dollars storing data that they actually don't have any plans or like ability to consume. And I think well, people say, oh, it might be useful someday, and or like, oh, maybe the data is the new gold, and we're gonna turn this into like a fine-tuned LLM model. Well, I don't think that's how it really works, because like yeah, I mean, it's just not prioritized, and I don't really know if they done a good analysis of like what data is actually useful and what do we need to actually feed into our deep learning models. There's no like plan or like a process for that. I'll just like double click into poor data governance real quick. I think what I mean by that is not only do they not know what tables they have and like where it is and like how much they're paying for to store that data, and like how many people that they are hiring to maintain that pipeline. There's no like concept of like a total cost of ownership of like a particular data set. But like, not only that, aside from using some secret managers to like, block like access based on your SSO credentials or something like that, I don't think there was like a very high, like very fine granularity control over these data sets that people are consuming with like very transparent policies of like who gets to read this data set, how, and like what runtime they can use to consume it. For example, if I'm a team that somehow needs your team's data, I know some like very reputable banks that store data in some S3 bucket with
Mm,
like very poorly configured, bucket policies that, like doesn't really stop someone from, I don't know, like I'm just saying that it's very insecure if you think about it that way. So some teams are maintaining their data access policies in like an S3 bucket policy. Some teams are relying on Hive Metastore, or like some teams are using Glue data catalog. Some teams are using like a Snowflake, which I think comes with like a nice catalog on its own. But like not everything is in Snowflake, right?
yeah.
So the bottom line is that, yeah, I think a lot of data teams are underperforming in my opinion. Like they're not, like they're just like very specializing in their own like one team's data responsibilities.
Yeah.
They're very good at like keeping at the latency and like all these like operating metrics for their data service, good. But as in terms of like making the entire company better, I don't think most teams think like that, right? They're not really thinking about, okay, well, how do we really productize this data? Everyone talks about productizing their data, like data mesh or whatever. But I think it's more of like a pipe dream for now, right? Based on like the reality of poor data governance in most companies.
Yeah. So did you get much time to see kind of AWS and Amazon's data infrastructure? Were you able to like kind of view and compare both? Like what the
It's very siloed too.
ah
But Amazon, it makes more sense because one is like an e-commerce company,
yeah.
and one is like a
Yeah.
cloud infrastructure company. So, but like within that, I think Amazon is a little bit different because like, I mean, I can't be like a authoritative source on it because like it's such a huge company. I would say that Amazon just by design is not like a very like a it's not the most like a centrally coordinated company out there. I mean, by definition, I think Jeff Bezos, he himself said, you know, he popularized pizza teams. Like, you have like 8 guys like working on a new service, and like they don't have to like talk to other people. Like it's kind of like everything's like a microservice.
Yeah.
So if everything is a microservice, then you're not gonna get like you aren't really going to be doing a lot of meta analysis over how things are going overall globally, right? So yeah, I mean it's very siloed to my limited knowledge.
Yeah. No, I was asking because when I think about Facebook, obviously there's the aspect of things being siloed and teams kind of do their own thing. It was my first experience to what people call a data mesh, but no one at Facebook called it that. We just everyone did their own thing. Everyone treated data like a product, and in some ways, obviously, yes, everyone's doing their own thing, but because everything's in a single layer, right? Like everything was kind of stored in different namespaces, but in some HDFS like data store underneath. They had the ability to kind of give you one layer of like access to it in a way. So there were a lot of benefits to that. And then you brought up security, and that was definitely something that they spent a lot of time doing. I remember I had to create for a long time. I had to create 2 different tables in many cases because one table would be like this like it'd have all the data that we wouldn't want most people to see, and then we'd have another table that'd be like, okay, anyone can query this table. Because for a long time we only had like table level access where it was like, okay, we can only stop people from accessing certain tables, so we have to build 2 tables. But a lot of that was due to the fact that we were using like this HDFS underneath everything. which didn't manage security. So we had to put a whole other. We were like literally having to build security on top of that, and that's one thing I do often wonder with, like, you referenced the S3 kind of setup, which is how do companies all manage this like S3 approach when you're trying to build tables, and like you said, you might be able to use a different runtime altogether to access wherever you're storing that data in kind of this more open format.
Like the typical solution is generally to decouple storage and like your catalog, right? And you let people pick their like where the data is physically located. I think, you know, just the Facebook and Amazon comparison. I think for Facebook, you guys probably had a much better data access layer, probably because for example, like if you guys are creating a new model, it might need a feature from the feed, or it might need a feature from like groups. So like by definition, like, you know, you guys were creating a lot of models, required a lot of data from different disparate places. So I think it was like an urgent pain point for you guys.
Yeah.
However, you know, if you're like sharing like data between like DynamoDB team and like, you know, like an EMR team or something like that, you know, I mean, is there really like an urgent issue here? I mean, there might be an urgent issue later, but like, so I would say, yeah, I mean, are you like a ML driven company from like a CEO level? You know, I think, you know, that's the answer right there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, kind of going back to, you know, enterprises and pretty much every company that's not maybe more in big tech, you know, how do you view them kind of taking on AI? Because you were working kind of in the generative AI space for AWS. How is that going? Because you said, again, their data infrastructure is kind of a little bit haphazard. It sounds like over provisioned. How does that kind of go when the world is like, hey, now let's stick AI on top of all of that?
Yeah. So in 2023, so last year, let me break it up into two parts. Like first, because the data infrastructure is not like AI friendly, and because AI itself, people really didn't know what it would be very useful for. People just did a lot of proof of concepts for the first year. And these proof of concepts were things like making like a LLM chatbot for internal purposes, or things. And by scoping it down like that to make like an LLM app just serving internal customers, you're already kind of like removing a lot of the tail risk of like data leaks and like, you know, poor data entitlements. Of course, like, you know, there were still some situations where like company would make a HR chatbot, and like I can ask the HR chatbot, hey, so how much is the other guy making? And like, you know, you might not have a concept of like, oh, I'm not allowed to like do a retrieval on this data set because like it's actually like private to that person. And so like yeah, even just like making a simple chatbot like that, you can imagine requires some sophisticated runtime data entitlement checks and like things like that. And if you think about it, the LLM is probably served off of some API, right? So this API, which is owned by one service team, now has to get data in real time from another team that actually owns the HR data. And those teams have to like talk to each other about like how to like provide this data on what level and things like that. So you can imagine like, you know, making some chatbot on your laptop is very easy compared to like making some chatbot for internal purposes and some big company, even if you're just like doing some internal POC, right? So that was what like most companies were doing like in 2023, just figuring out like what this technology is all about, and like also figuring out internal corporate politics about like which teams are going to work on AI and like what teams are not going to work on AI, all that stupid stuff. And then like 2024 was about, okay, let's like actually scale some of these successful experiments. I think like customer support is still like a very popular one. You know, like makes like, so take some of the queries that you can get from like agents and then make an LLM answer it. By the way, like I tell people all the time, like this industry used to exist like even 10 years ago. Like, so it's not like LLM suddenly made chatbot customer service like a thing. I mean, it was already a thing like 10 years ago. It just was very time consuming and manual to like set up the rules based engines to like make these chatbots. So, but LLMs made it a lot easier. But that being said, like I said, data entitlements and like all this like other edge cases still make it harder from an engineering perspective than it sounds. So 2024, like, and the other popular ones would be things like a document processing, right? Then again, of course, like, I think a popular one would be like, like a bank receiving your, like driver's license and like your, bank statements, and like, the banks want to like take all this document and, come up with like a mortgage approval like decision or something like that. And LLMs could be useful for that. So there's a lot of effort on that front. But like I said, like all of these industries used to exist already. It's just that LLMs are accelerating it and is bringing on new competitors and things like that. And LLMs, I think, just increase the general awareness about AI. So, like previously, if a company had to like really pull like teeth to like convince CEOs that AI can do anything, now like CEOs more or less understand that, okay, we might need some AI solution here. That being said, from a vendor perspective, if you're like a startup selling this like point solution, you also have a lot more competitors because LLMs did make it easier for you to make this, which used to be really hard. And not only that, you're also competing with like Google and Amazon that may have their own solutions. So like there's like Google like Document Cloud and like Amazon Textract now competing with like, like companies like Unstructured or like, some of the smaller ones that do like OCR and like like things like that. Just, yeah, I mean, there's just more AI. Doesn't mean that things are drastically different. And companies are overwhelmingly slowed down by politics and poor data governance more than anything. Like even in November 2024, I know some companies that don't allow you to use like GitHub Copilot for coding or any code assistance. So, I mean, is that a bad thing or a good thing? I don't know, but like it's not it doesn't feel like an optimal decision. So either, if you're worried about privacy, just like self-host your own LLM powered coding chatbot, but they don't even do that. So I mean, yeah, I mean, like so outside of the LinkedIn and Twitter bubble, which I avoid myself, people still don't care that much about AI in some sense. Like I would say that.
Yeah. I think it's, you brought up chatbots and specifically around customer service. It does feel like that's something that has been played out, and really in a weird way, the way I always view it, or I've kind of viewed it, the current experience is not great, right? Because most of the time, all you want to do is get to your representative, right? Unless you have like something, for some reason you're calling your credit card company because you want to know your balance, which for me, I'm like, I'm just going to go online. I'm not going to call anyone. I'm a millennial. I don't like calling. So to me, it's just like the only thing you're maybe trying to do is deal with that as well. Is like, okay, can we maybe reduce the number of times people call for representative and give them, remove another 20% or 50% of use cases where people are just, just need to talk.
So I'll let you in on a little secret. The things that LLMs could be useful for are often things that might lose the company money. So maybe the friction is there for a reason, right? Like, I mean, so I'm just saying, like, you don't want LLM to like have the authority to hand out refunds.
Yeah.
Um, and also, if you piss a customer off, like, will he really churn? I don't know, like, so I'm just saying, like, it sounds like a no-brainer, but often in life, like, it will take a lot more for a company to change direction that drastically.
Yeah. That makes me think of, I recall early on in my career going to a talk where someone talked about kind of how they built a model to try to help detect churn, and like their goal was to like call people up, and if they thought they were about to churn, they'd like try to save that that account. But what they ended up finding after spending whatever a year on this is they ended up losing money, because now you've just removed the friction between someone like, oh, you've called me, thank you. Actually, I want to cancel. Great, perfect. I was thinking about it for the last week, so they actually had the opposite.
I also like to give you one very quick gnarly example. So, say you're an airline and you want customers to be able to reschedule with an LLM, okay? And there is no technical issues with it. But it's not just your company that can make that decision. So, like, if you're an airline, to reschedule a flight, you have to like talk to some other company's third-party APIs now.
Yeah.
So it's not just your call. It's not just your call anymore. Like, everything is so interconnected that, of course, like, you would love to help so like when you try to like reschedule your flight with your like Chase Travel or something like that, there's a human that needs to like talk to another human or like another system that is like completely disconnected from your system.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the challenge of like building these like seemingly dumb chatbots, because like chatbots in some sense it's almost like HTML now. It's basically like HTML, like it's so it didn't really like solve like some of the other issues that are still out there.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of like how you're seeing it change like workflows, have you kind of seen it impact any data professionals' workflows, whether it be analysts or data engineers?
So a lot more unstructured data processing, like for things like turning things into JSON, and the adoption is actually in the most in like areas like finance again,
Yeah.
like hedge funds that used to have to pay vendors like Bloomberg or whatever, I don't know, like 50K a year to get some, values out of like 10K, like SEC statements or some SEC documents. Now you can kind of like spend $800 on OpenAI credits to get that. So lots of like unstructured data processing. Of course, like, that doesn't mean that they can make money off of those models directly. It's just like this is just another feature into their models. In normal companies, like, I think it helped democratize some of the complex SQL writing in some sense. Like, so, yeah, people laugh when people still like don't really trust, text to SQL like engines, but people don't understand like the bigger picture here. It's the goal is to not produce perfect SQL. The goal is to actually save you some time. Like, and in that regard, I see the starting point of more and more engineering projects kind of start with like some LLM query. Now, but the real killer use case might be to just refactor and transpile and translate legacy code that is written in some like very old version of Java to like a newer, like, more functional, like programming friendly versions of Java or like Python or something like that. Because like even that is very huge because, say you have a bunch of like Scala jobs, okay? And it costs like 2x to hire a Scala engineer than a Python engineer. Then no brainer, just like, just rewrite everything, all your old Scala code into Python. Just like, normalize everything into one code base. Then yeah, like, it kind of lowers the barrier of entry for like someone to get to understand the code base and like get productive. So the benefits are not always like visible, but it's there, and I think it's highly dependent on how smart is the person who's like making these decisions at a technical leadership level to fully leverage these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say, like, I've had multiple cases now where I've had to like migrate, different libraries from or different languages into another. Maybe someone wrote something in JavaScript for some data pipelines, and you're like, all right, now I got to make this into Python for some reason, and it does make it just considerably faster when you're just like, all right, I could read through all of this and try to understand it, or I could translate it, and at the very least get us to a place where it's going to require a little more fine tuning afterwards, but most of it is there. And either way, you've got to read through a programming language you haven't, or a project that you haven't written, so you're gonna have to understand it one way or the other.
It's also very good at things like enforcing some like code standard. So like say you have some person who worked at Google come to Meta and then start writing code in a googly way. But like, you might now have like a LLM that's trained it with like Meta standards for like how to use tabs and whatever. All that like BS about like code reviews getting rejected because like you didn't follow some stupid like rule. Like I mean, a lot of that can be reduced, and that's a lot of time saved.
Yeah, I mean, at Facebook, the big time save, and maybe you can add in another layer of an LLM. The big time save was just everyone started using a standardized formatter, and that was like suddenly all nits went away, right? Like no one's really making any nits unless it's like a naming convention or something. But all like, oh, this isn't tabbed correctly. It's like, well, that's not a problem because we've set the standard, and when you save your file, it'll just automatically be saved in the way that we want it to be saved. So I think that's
yeah. I mean, like every engineer has like painful memories of like people being like very nitpicky about some random thing and like getting their code review requests like rejected and things like that. I think if you think about it, I think like LLMs can automate a lot of that. You're not entrusting LLM to like issue refunds or like things like that or automate everything, but yeah, I mean like it could improve your lives quite a lot.
Yeah. No, I
Which is
think
why
that's
I'm bullish on. Which is why I'm generally bullish on like code, like gen type of use cases. Which is separate from asking, will this become like a $1 trillion industry? I don't think so, but it's still like it's something to watch out for.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and we'll find out all the use cases over time. I think it was the same with deep neural networks kind of being the same. I mean, obviously there's some crossover there, but I remember just reading papers about how neural networks could possibly beat like traditional forecasting methods. And you'd see this overly complex approach to forecasting, and then I think in the end most of them would be like, actually forecasting is pretty good. Our really borderline basic forecasting is not bad. Where it could come in handy is like if you want to interject in maybe something like news articles or something that can like actually provide more than just historical trends, but also try to track some newer points of information. So you've kind of got again a mixed background, but for someone who's maybe looking to transition from being someone who's worked like in AI and ML and software, starting their own venture, do you have any advice to offer?
Yeah, so this is more like a fuzzy advice. I have one fuzzy advice and one like a hard advice. I think the fuzzy advice is that you should probably think really hard about why you want to do it. Because generally speaking, working at a company and being a specialist, which I think most people are forced to if you work at a big company, is very different from kind of doing your own creative projects, and especially to make a living off of it. So I think you kind of have to first think about why you're trying to do it, because it's actually hard. And hard to sort of like be creative all the time. I know it sounds kind of weird, or I guess like, but I mean, it's something that I also like realized, but I only realized by actually doing. Um, so all I'm really saying is that if you can come to a conclusion whether it's the right fit for you without actually like spending years like trying to be entrepreneur or whatever, and just to get to know yourself better, I think it's a good use of time to like take like a month to think about it. Um, the If you're an AI guy and want to do something different, that's I highly recommend. If you're at a company, just like try to get a role where you're exposed to different people.
Hmm.
So like what I mean by that is that so if you're like if you're ML engineer, and you're already talking to a lot of PMs, like try to figure out what happens after you deploy, and like then what maybe sit on one of those like status meetings that your product manager has to go into. Like just listen to what these guys talk about. Like what metrics do they actually track after you ship something? Like what kind of questions do they get from the business leaders? Because like when you're an engineer, you just hear stories about like our VP is like upset about our KPIs going down, but you don't really understand what that means until you actually sit in one of those metric meetings. But which, by the way, you can kind of crash. Um, like like I don't think there's any gatekeeping there for most meetings. So yeah, just like sit there and just like try to understand like the bigger picture of like how your product is viewed in your company. And I think that kind of gives you like a bigger sense of like, oh, okay, is my project actually useful to the world, to the company? What is the future direction of this department? And how is this relevant to like you being a better, like more well-rounded person? I think is really that, when you're like a technical guy, I think it's very easy to get steeped into the technical topics and technical issues of everything. But I think, um, like from the end user's perspective, often it doesn't really matter. So I think you kind of want to, dive into different things and just like see like if there's a bigger meaning to all of this. And if that interests you, then just keep following the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think there's something there where I often view that there's like a point of diminishing return in terms of like technically horizontal skilling, right? Like just constantly being like, oh, I'm going to learn a new framework. At least if it's still in the same space, right? Like, okay, I learned, React. Now I'm going to learn Vue. Now I'm going to learn, all these tools and that kind of overlap. I feel like sometimes it can limit your ability to like you said, like have better perspective and see what actually is worth doing. Obviously, if you like being a specialist and what you want to do is like, I just want to do front end work and I never want to think about what the value is of my work. I mean, that is a reality that you can have, and you can just have someone tell you what to do. But I think there's something to be said about trying to figure out what's the point of what I'm doing? Like, I'm building a data pipeline. Why? Like, why does it matter? What does it do? I'm building a model. Why? Like, am I actually driving any business value, or is it just that some VP, like you kind of referenced earlier, like VPs all have their politics on who gets to drive the AI project. Some VPs decided that they think this is important, and they might have no idea in terms of what's actually important because their perspective is purely business.
Yeah, I mean, I used to like mentor this person, or I didn't really, I guess like I used to know this guy who spent like 5 years of his career basically maintaining a data pipeline that like fed like license plate information to a model that fed into another model that fed into another model at a large bank. And I'm like, okay, like is that like enough learning, right? I mean, so I think it's like I said, I mean, that person's perfectly happy, but I think it's very individual dependent on what makes you happy in your career. And if you're like maintaining one feature like pipeline for your whole career, I mean, how much do you really learn? I think that's another thing to ask yourself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And at that point, the question is, are you just happy doing that, like you said, or do you want
Yeah,
more? And some people are. Some people, it's like, why rock the boat if it works?
that's true.
Why make your life harder? So no, I think it's true. Cool. Well, we're coming up on time here, so I just want to be mindful of that. But I don't know. Do you have any other final thoughts in terms of like where you see kind of AI as someone that writes a lot about it, and probably thinks a lot about it, where you see things going?
Yeah, I mean, there's a phrase like like a boiling the frog. So I mean, the change has been happening and is continuing to happen, and most likely, most people will just kind of wake up one day and be like, "Wow, world is very different." Kind of like with mobile, like it just kind of crept up into you, and now you're on your phone 6 hours a week, or sorry, 6 hours a day. Um, I think if you're a coder, you're feeling it more than others. Just like talk to your mom; she probably like may have used ChatGPT like once a week or something like that. But yeah, I mean, like, I think change is happening. The winners and losers of this change, I think, might be more different from mobile, which I think benefited a lot of people. But I think with AI, this is like a slightly pessimistic view, but I think it's a bit more like narrow in terms of like who it actually like accrues all the capital to.
Mm.
Like I don't really imagine a lot of open AI type of companies. Maybe open AI is like the last open AI, right? I mean, it's kind of like uh, whereas like with mobile revolution, like you had a lot of app companies that pop up. Uh, with internet, you got like Yelp, like Facebook, all these like social media companies. They're just like I think the best way to think about it is that I think LLM is like one very like narrow interface where you're interacting with. It literally is like one text box, right?
Yeah.
And with apps, like there's infinite ways to customize it. So I think I think it's definitely not easy for like the average company to like try to compete with like the large AI companies. But yeah, I mean, overall, whatever happens, like, yeah, there'll be a lot of change, and it's probably not up to us whether there's a change or not. So I think, yeah, that's my parting thought.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. It will be interesting to see kind of what changes in the next little bit. That makes, like, you brought up mobile, and it's funny because I think they often reference that, at a certain point, Mark was like, okay, Mark from Facebook was like, okay, we're gonna do mobile only. And nowadays, right, like it makes sense. You're like, of course, like that was the obvious call. But it is one of those things where it makes sense looking back, but I imagine, I wasn't thinking about it back then. I imagine it didn't make sense back then. I imagine it's like, what? No, everyone's on their computers. Why would we go to a smaller screen with a thing that has limited charge, like, all these limitations? But yeah, it is one of those things that suddenly it happens and it just feels like an obvious fact, but it wasn't always that way. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Well, anyways, yeah, thanks for this, live, and yeah, it was very fun. Yeah, like check out my blog if you want. You know, and yeah, stay in touch, Ben.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks so much for everything you shared. I think everyone appreciated it. Thank you again for your time.
All right, take care, guys. See you.
Bye.